A message from your scribe.
In the mid-19th century Vienna there were two obstetrics clinics. One was intended for midwifery students, while the other was for medical students. The clinic for aspiring medical practitioners had a very bad reputation. The last thing a pregnant woman wanted was to end up in that clinic, primarily due to its high mortality rate. In the medical students' hospital the mortality rate was twice as high. When a doctor named Semmelweis decided to shake things up and accuse the doctors of lacking proper hygiene, which he connected to the high mortality rate of the patients, he was discredited in eyes of whole medical world. The story itself is quite well known, but I'm presenting it to you because it illustrates the division between the worlds of women and men. Doctors appear as arrogant and cocky, convinced of their infallibility. Meanwhile, women are reduced to the role of midwives, as if they were unworthy of becoming doctors. This state of affairs had persisted in Europe since ancient times and intensified, especially with the advent of Renaissance. This happened due to generally lower percentage of women receiving education and originally, in part because of Greeks, who also laid the foundations for the place of women in European societies for many centuries. The development of science, including medicine, has always been closely intertwined with the prevailing socio-cultural conditions. These conditions have ascribed different roles to both men and women since ancient times, and there is nothing inherently wrong with this, as the differences between genders are evident and have evolved into the initial social structures. The problem arises when constructs created by societies, often dating back to the Neolithic Revolution, restrict or hinder access to education and limit legal personality. In ancient Athens, we observe an overrepresentation of men, not only in politics, culture, but also in medicine. One could say that women had a different role, and this is indeed true. However, a person's role in society should not restrict their freedom to choose their life path. This was the reality for women in ancient Athens, but it doesn't represent the entirety of Hellenic society. Women enjoyed much greater autonomy in other Greek poleis, such as in Sparta or in Cretan city of Gortyn. In Athens, on the other hand, the law effectively denied women an independent existence because they lacked legal status. According to the law, a woman wasn't even considered a citizen of a polis. She was merely a part of the living inventory of the household known as oikos. Similar to many other ancient civilizations, women were subject to the authority first of their fathers and then their husbands. Such a man bearing the title Kyrios was responsible not only for providing for the woman's welfare, but also served as the intermediary between the woman and the public sphere, to which she had no access. The same restrictions applied to the medicine as well. In most Greek poleis, at least from archaic times, women were absolutely prohibited from practicing as physicians or midwives under the penalty of death. Of course, this wasn't the case everywhere or at all times. There is some evidence suggesting that during the time of Hippocrates, women had access to his school on the island of Kos and another school in Cnidos. However, these reports are uncertain, as some researchers entirely dispute them, while others argue that it was indeed the case, but that the ban on attending medical schools was reinstated after Hippocrates' death. Nevertheless, the fact that women were excluded from the public life and had limited access to education in Greece did not mean that they didn't attempt to educate themselves on their own. Women who assisted in childbirth received practical training from other midwives. Young apprentices didn't acquire their education in Greek schools, they learned it individually, as part of the tradition passed down from generation to generation. Often these traditions were family-based, so if a mother was a midwife, it was highly likely that her daughter would also follow in her footsteps. It was later supplemented by the works of Greek physicians like Soranus and Galen, which were specifically intended for midwives. So even though societal conventions were maintained, in reality male doctors accepted the existence of female medical professions. The demand for midwifery and medical services provided by female doctors, or especially midwives, was high, particularly for gynecological issues. In such cases, examinations were often not conducted by a doctor, but by a female assistant. These assistants were most commonly the wives of the physicians themselves. During gynecological examinations, the male doctor would either work alongside an assistant or instruct the patient on how to conduct the examination herself. Women also took precedence in matters of pregnancy. All of this stemmed from a certain level of distrust and embarrassment towards male doctors. While doctors in Greece likely treated their female patients with professionalism, they were always seen as a deviation from the norm, which was male patients. In medical treatises and philosophical writings, we find evidence of the view that female body, especially in case of genitals, was somewhat defining their social role. Women's bodies were described as the inverse of men's, with their reproductive organs turned inward. This viewpoint was often associated with spiritual or moral imperfection. The male body was considered ideal, while the female body was seen as flawed. Returning to the topic of childbirth, it caused significant anxiety not only among expectant mothers, but also among their families assisting midwives and doctors. This is well illustrated by the statement of the titular character in Euripides' tragedy, Medea, who says, "I would rather stand 3 times with a shield in battle than give birth once." Death during childbirth was more of a rule than an exception in ancient times, with mortality rates hovering around 15%. Low or non-existent hygiene standards, along with a high number of adolescent pregnancies, only made things even worse. While death during a labor was common, it doesn't mean it became ordinary for the people in Greek polis. Some mothers who lost their lives in childbirth were even commemorated with epitaphs. Unhappy Nasilla, why does it stand on your tomb, this picture of your daughter Neotima whom you lament, her whose life was taken from her by the pangs of labor? She lies in her dear mother's arms as if heavy cloud had gathered on her eyelids, and, alas, not far away her father Aristotle rests his head in his right hand. O most miserable pair, not even in death have you forgotten your grief. Only women assisted in childbirth, and doctors were called only in emergency or during prolonged labors. A woman about to give birth usually relied on the help of a midwife as well as her friends or close family, such as her mother or sisters. Childbirth, unsurprisingly, mostly took place in the homes of future mothers. While Greek treatises dedicate little space to this subject, we know that women often gave birth in sitting position. Sometimes they used steam baths or fumigation with aromatic herbs. If standard methods did not work, midwives resorted to somewhat unconventional techniques. When a woman was in labor, 4 people would grab each of her limbs and shake her firmly, which likely helped when the baby was positioned abnormally. Once the newborn and the afterbirth had left the mother's body, the women present at the scene would engage in a ceremonial cry of joy and bathe the mother's body, officially concluding the pregnancy in a symbolic manner. But the process didn't end there. In many parts of Greece there was a custom of tightly wrapping newborns in swaddling clothes, apparently believing that their limbs would become deformed, if not molded into their natural shape while still soft. The birth was later announced to the local community by attaching appropriate symbols to the door of the house, an olive crown if a boy was born, or a tuft of wool, indicating future involvement in wool production if it was a girl. It was the midwife's duty to provide care for the mother and the newborn for several days after the birth. One of the unpleasant tasks might have been preparing the child for the process of exposure, the moment when the father decided whether the child should be abandoned or raised. In Greek societies there was a need for women to be involved in medical professions, although having such a woman in the family was not a source of pride, especially among the aristocracy. In Plato's dialogue Theaetetus with Socrates, the latter is said to be the son of a midwife. Since the philosopher could not deny existence of his own mother, he carried this legacy with pride. Socrates even claimed that, like his mother, who was a midwife, he also helped people, but not young women, rather young men. His students were to give birth not to children, but to beautiful thoughts. Socrates compared growing up to the pains of a childbirth and miscarriage to thoughts poisoned, conflicting with one's moral compass. Though Socrates' statements were veiled, they seem to express admiration for midwives, which Plato, the author of a dialogue, also shared with his master. In his speculations about the ideal state, Plato envisions a society in which the most advanced intellects can become doctors and even rulers, regardless of their gender. He uses the example of the existing and accepted practice at the time to support his argument about high competence of women in the ideal state. During Plato's time, women practicing as doctors were still rare, but not as much of a phenomenon as few centuries earlier. Plato's enlightened view is supported by a few inscriptions that describe women in medicine not only as midwives, but also as physicians. However, these few records cannot be taken as a definitive proof that women in that era practiced medicine without limitations. Nevertheless, some changes were indeed occurring, as we find traces of it in the language. The term iatrin, meaning female physician, appears in various inscriptions across the Aegean as the feminine form of iatros, likely due to the growing number of women in medicine. The term iatromaia describes a woman who underwent more specialized training and is composed of iatra and maia. Already in the 1st century BC, the relationships between male and female doctors began to be warmer, and members of these professions were treated with equal respect, especially among each other, as confirmed by letters sent from male doctors to female doctors. This whole revolution and a complete change in attitude towards women in medical professions was to be brought about by the figure of Agnodike, a legendary figure whose fate was described by one of the Roman historians. The ancients didn't have obstetricians, and as a result women, because of modesty, perished, for the Athenians forbade slaves and women to learn the art of medicine. A certain girl, Agnodike, desired to learn medicine, and since she desired it, she cut her hair and in male attire came to a certain Hierophilus for training. When she had learned the art and had heard that a woman was in labor, she came to her. And when the woman refused to trust herself to her, thinking that she was a man, she removed her garment to show that she was a woman, and in this way she treated women. When the doctors saw that they were not admitted to women, they began to accuse Agnodike, saying that he was a seducer and corrupter of women, and that the women were pretending to be ill. The Areopagites in session started to condemn Agnodike, but Agnodike removed her garment for them and showed that she was a woman. Then the doctors began to accuse her more vigorously, and as a result the leading women came to the court and said, "You are not husbands, but enemies, because you condemned her who discovered safety for us." Then the Athenians amended the law so that freeborn women could learn the art of medicine. Agnodike's story provides an excellent example of how, even under the most unfavorable conditions, a woman can succeed despite the odds, even in strongly patriarchal Athens. She initiated the events that were likely to bring about an extensive social changes. It seems that in Athens the law was liberalized and women could finally pursue education legally and become full-fledged physicians or practice midwifery without fear for their lives. While this story is most likely work of literacy fiction, it reflects the real sentiments of women in Greece between 4th and 3rd centuries BC.